I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, but I do want to introduce our moderator, Delia Cheung Hom. And Delia Cheung Hom joined Northeastern in June 2006 to serve as the Assistant Director for the Asian American Center at Northeastern. She is currently serving at as the center's second director. Before joining the staff, Delia worked in student affairs at the University of California, Riverside. She served as the graduate intern for student organizations for 1 year and served as a program coordinator in Asian Pacific student programs for 4 years. Delia's passion for working with Asian American students stems from her experiences as an undergraduate at Vassar College. She is a supporter of liberal arts education, and she graduated with a BA in cognitive science, and she's currently doing something completely unrelated to her major. Delia also earned an MA in cognitive science from Johns Hopkins University and an MA in education from Claremont Graduate University. A lifelong learner, Delia is currently pursuing an EDD with a concentration in higher education administration. Her dissertation focuses on the experiences of Asian American college students and their sense of belonging on campus. Welcome, panelists, and welcome, Delia.
I'm really thrilled to be here. I think this panel and this opportunity brings together probably two of my favorite things in the world, which are libraries and Asian American women. So I think what I wanted to make sure that we did in this space was first to acknowledge just the importance of creating a space like this, especially looking at both Asian American identity and women in leadership. I think this is something that's really fundamentally important, and understanding that in the context of celebrating Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, it's also important to understand the complex experiences of the Asian American community. So looking at gender, I think, is a really critical space for this. I also want to acknowledge, the breadth of the Asian American experience, which is not confined to just talking about race and gender, and so wanting to acknowledge that as we move into this panel. I also just wanted to start off with a quote that I think is particularly meaningful, especially thinking about Asian American women, and it's from Audre Lorde's Litany for Survival, and she says, when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. So I think, I want to use these words to start off this panel as a way to say, this is a space to think about, what our identities mean in the context of Asian American Heritage Month, but also in terms of our experiences as Asian American women. So I'm going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves, but I gave everyone a question to start everyone off to thinking about their own personal experiences. So that question was for you to share an experience or story about a time that was influential or meaningful in your own understanding of what it means to be an Asian American woman. So I guess I will pass it off down here, and we'll try to keep the first sort of comments relatively brief so that we can move on, and I really hope that this emerges into a really fruitful conversation amongst everybody.
Thank you, Delia. Can people hear me? Okay. So it's interesting to be here on stage as somebody who does self-identify as Asian American and Korean American, as well as a librarian and a community leader who cares about racial and gender issues. And what I wanted to share, I guess, I thought it was a really thought-provoking question that Delia asked, a meaningful experience in my own understanding about what it means to be an Asian American woman. I think I want to actually share personal experience that touches on the professional realm as well. So my first visit to Korea, it's my homeland. I was adopted from there when I was a little baby. And that was the first time where I met
this whole community of adoptees, these amazing people, including a lot of amazing women adoptees. And it was the first time that I heard about their adoption stories and their journeys. And it was also the first time that I researched my family roots, as well as visited the town in which I was born. And I visited my orphanage, as well as saw the street where I was found. And I saw my first photo, which was in this whole book at the police station of abandoned babies. And I found out that I was approximately 6 days old when I was found. So as a mother of 2 young children now, it makes me think even more about my birth mother and how hard it must have been for her to birth a child into the world and then to not know what happened to that child and if she's okay. This experience, it awakened and deepened my participation and identity in the transnational adoptee experience, the immigrant experience, and both the Asian American experience as well as the Korean experience. And it helped to form my identity and development, and it actually helped to affirm a couple of things for me. One, that I was indeed part of the Asian American experience. I think I've always kind of felt on the outside of that up till this point in time, and that I also was an important part of Korean history. As part of this trip, I was also a U.S. delegate for IFLA, the International Federation of Libraries, and they were holding their international conference in Seoul. So it was also affirming for me to represent the United States as a United States delegate and be part of the global leadership of libraries and to learn more about international library issues. Thanks, Delia.
Hi, I'm Batsuri Sivangsai, and I identify as a Laotian American woman. And it's the reason why I identify myself that way is because I was born in Laos. I came over to the United States as a refugee immigrant, leaving my homeland of Laos when I was 2 years old and living in the refugee camps for another 2 years, finally arriving in the US at 4 years old. My parents, they also were displaced when they were much younger. So my mother, from the ages of 4 to 11, was displaced about a dozen or so more times. And it was because of the Vietnam War and the Civil War in Laos that she was displaced. But my mom worked really hard. She went to school, she went to nursing school and became a nurse, and then again had to decide to leave the country when my father had to seek refuge. My father was a principal in Laos, and he had to seek refuge because of his father's role in the Vietnam War and the Civil War. So when I got to the United States, you can imagine that things were quite different. You know, my mother wasn't a nurse, my father wasn't a principal. They ended up being janitors and factory workers. And at 4.5 years old, I understood that difference. I even asked my mother, you know, Mom, you are taking an interesting job now. You know, you're cleaning toilets. That wasn't your role before. And I think my mother was really taken aback that I had that awareness. You know, she and my father worked over 12 hours a week because they took odd jobs. And I saw that I had to work hard and harder and really find support in the community in order for me to succeed, just like my parents did when they were younger. So I worked really hard. I opened up an egg roll business when I was 11 years old, and I sold them to my parents' factory colleagues and to attorneys and the judge. And I like to say that they're undocumented egg rolls because at the age of 11, Who knew I had to have legal documents? So as you can see, I worked really hard. I was really focused when I was younger. When I had decided to go on to law school to earn a legal degree just to advocate for the community and give back to the community, one very influential moment to me was when I was with my aunt, and as you know, sometimes aunts say things in public that they're not ashamed of. So my mom told her that I wanted to go to law school, and she said, I don't think you should waste your money because your daughter is a Lao woman and she's gonna be in a white male space. And I don't think you should waste your money and time doing that. So I was really upset because this was my mom's blood relative who was telling her that I shouldn't pursue my dreams and that my mom shouldn't support my dreams. But luckily I have a very supportive mom who said, you know, I think I will always support my daughter because I'm afraid that if I don't, then it will be my fault that her dreams are not achieved. So while I did live in a very environment where I didn't have a lot of opportunities, I had a lot of folks like my mother and my godmother supporting me. I did go on to law school. I opened up my law practice and then later on became director of public policy for Counselor Tito Jackson, working on housing and economic development and education. And I continue to do that work here in the Cambridge community, helping parents organize, helping the community think about equity and inclusion. And I'd like to say that, you know, every time I think there's a challenge that I can't overcome or that people see my gender or my race as an obstacle, I think about my mother and I think about our own community and how our own community can be very critical of each other. But at the same time, I think that there's enough of us that want to see all of us succeed and be supportive, and I want to build that type of opportunity for other folks. So I'm so very happy for Delia to be moderating and Maria to inviting all of us here to join at the public library. I hope to hear from a lot of you and hopefully answer your questions.
Good evening. Thanks. Good evening. My name is Iram Farooq. Those are tough stories to follow. I grew up in New Delhi in India, so I've only very recently started thinking of myself as Asian American because I only got my American citizenship a couple of years ago, even though I've lived in the US for a long time. And that had to do with the fact that India doesn't allow dual citizenship, and it's only recently that they started to have a kind of odd little hybrid thing that is comparable to something a little bit like dual citizenship. So it kind of had this interesting situation where friends of mine said I was common law American from having lived here so long, but it was such a wrench to kind of give up the roots that you were born with, even though you're in a different country. I grew up in a very privileged environment in some ways. My parents were both academics, and we weren't rich, but we were comfortable, and I had a very kind of went to school every day. Was not expected to work. In fact, that was considered not really right in India when I was growing up, because you were really supposed to focus on school, especially the kind of academic group that my parents belonged to. So whether you were, this was unusual, because whether you were female or male, the expectation in my family, and I'm one of two siblings, I have a brother, we were both expected to really focus and really work hard on school. And there was no focus on no sports, no frittering away time on anything. It was just an extremely focused, extremely academic focused existence. And so to me, kind of the Indian experience as a young person growing up there was very much this consciousness that we are in a world that is hyper competitive with a lot of people vying for very few resources, and that everybody has to work incredibly hard to have the edge to be able to compete when the time comes, which was an now, as I think back, which was an odd little way to grow up. But at the same time, it was, I don't think it was unusual in Delhi, and especially in that stratum of society. And I think it has, in many ways, served me well because it's created this work ethic that I don't have to think about anymore, and it's just like that's the natural flow. But growing up growing up female in India is an unusual kind of experience because there are a lot of contradictions. I was born when Indira Gandhi was prime minister, so the notion of a woman as a leader was just, you did not have to think twice about it. But at the same time, this was also the country where female infanticide is prevalent, where women are expected to bring dowry when they get married, and if they don't, there is all kinds of abuse, including women. There are stories of women who would be burnt to death because they did not bring sufficient dowry, or they did not have a son as was expected. So it is it was growing up in the midst of these contradictions. And in my own personal family, my parents, my mother's family is incredibly traditional, and my father's family is not so much. So there was also this contradiction of being the traditional female role in which is, I think, quite similar to other Asian cultures, where you're supposed to be modest, you're supposed to be subservient, you are supposed to care more about the happiness of others compared to yourself. But at the same time, there is this expectation that you will do the most to make something of yourself as well. And it was a little bit confusing as a child, but it sort of shakes out in the end. So I can't say that there's a moment that crystallized this for me, and I think I was confused for a very long time and muddled through life somehow to this point.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kristine. Thank you for sharing space with us tonight, and thanks to the staff here for having me. I use she, her pronouns. I'm really lucky enough to work with Delia at Northeastern University, and I'm also a doctoral student. But more importantly, I'm Filipino American. I'm second generation. My parents are immigrants. I'm a first generation college student, and I'm still figuring out who I am. And similarly, when I was reading the questions, I couldn't really think of like a singular experience or story, and I suppose the question wasn't even meant to be that way. But I thought about my parents as being probably the most instrumental in shaping my socialization to become the woman that I am, particularly as an Asian American Pacific Islander woman. And I say that because growing up and seeing them take on their roles as parents, I thought it was just like normal that the roles were very shared. And then when I started to understand the patriarchy as a thing, I then started to understand that, okay, there are pretty significant separations with gender roles. But I am so appreciative that my parents didn't ascribe to those in the way that is traditionally expected, because I was able to experience a childhood where my mother is the head of the household. And if you ask my husband who the head of our household is, he would probably tell you it's me. And so I learned these messages of women being in charge, right? And it was never out of the ordinary for me. And it felt very normal, but progressing through my childhood and high school and being in predominantly white spaces, that wasn't so much the case. So my home life was very different from school and church life, etc., because everything didn't seem so aligned in the ways that I thought they should be. Because right when I'm born, my first socializations happened with my family. And so I'm just really appreciative that they had never limited me. And I often tell people that, you know, my life path has been really nonlinear. And I owe that to the grace that my parents have provided me, because they've always trusted that I could be whoever and whatever I wanted to be, because, you know, and similar to other stories, like, you know, they came here believing that we could attain greatness, whatever that might end up meaning for us. So yeah, I don't know if there was like a moment, but I think throughout my growing up, and even now as an adult, I still see them in the way they operate with each other and how they continue to parent me and my younger brother. And are there differences? Certainly, but they had always instilled this idea of pride, because I had never heard messages from them telling me to ascribe to whiteness or to be different from who I am, even though at a very young age I already knew and felt different from my classmates or others that I encountered. But I think their messaging, not only with their roles as parents, but also telling me that it's okay to be me. I think this idea of authenticity was rooted in me early. I didn't know it then, naturally, but only now as an adult can I be retrospective and to really understand and see that this is what my parents were doing, whether it was intentional or not. And, you know, so sometimes now as an adult, you know, they think I'm too outspoken or I have an attitude, and I'm like, well, think about where I got that from. But, you know, so, mom and dad. But again, like, I just am thankful that they didn't try to put me in a box in the ways that others could have or tried to, but rather nurtured my identity as an Asian American woman while trying to prepare me for the struggles that I have faced and will continue to face today. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I want to thank Maria for the very gracious introduction. I think my own experience growing up, was a little bit different. I identify as third generation Chinese American, and I was thinking about this panel and my own experiences. I was actually thinking about my experiences in the library and using the space in libraries as my own way to learn about my Asian American heritage. And I can remember going to the Asian American history section in my public library. I can tell you which wall it was on. It was sort of in the back, like down the side. It was 973. And that's where I found I started to discover, what does it mean to be Asian American? But I think, the piece that's really interesting is, for me, that was really juxtaposed with my identity as a woman. And I remember one of my mom's friends giving me a book about women's suffrage. It was called Born for Liberty, and it was all about white women, right? So here I am, this girl, trying to figure out, who am I and what does it mean to be me? And I'm going to the Asian American history section, which at that point was really dominated by male authors. There's a lot of white male authors. And then at the same time, as I'm trying to learn about what does it mean to be, a woman in America, I'm getting books about women's suffrage that don't really have anything to do with my experience or even my family's experience. And so I think trying to reconcile those two, pieces, that are living in one person that's walking around, was really an interesting thing to try to sort out, right? Because I'm reading about the history of, some of the early Chinese, immigrants who were, 98% men, right? So this aren't things that I can relate to. I'm reading about, women who are organizing and marching for voting rights, which were for white women, right? So trying to figure out, what does that mean, for me, and where do I fit into all of that? And so I heard, across, everyone's stories, the messaging that people were hearing growing up, and so I wanted to hear more from you all, about how did you learn, and how did you incorporate the messages that you heard, growing up with your experiences as an Asian American woman and now as leaders, in the community. How did you reconcile these messages, or how did you interpret them or bring them into your role as leaders? And we can go into any style or organization. We don't have to just go down the line, but open to sort of hearing stories build off of each other.
So just like Farooq, it was a very confusing experience for me growing up as a refugee and also Laotian American in southern Kansas. The majority of my neighbors were white Americans. My grandfather was the second Laotian. My grandfather, my step-grandmother, and their 3 children were the second Laotian Asian family to live in the town. So while at home we were very ethnically, culturally Lao, at school they were just learning about us as well. So the perspective that I got from growing up in such a small town of 10,000, that there wasn't much diversity, was that everybody knew we were Laotian. So there wasn't like, are you Chinese? Are you Japanese? Are you Korean? I didn't grow up people asking me that, because they knew that I was from Laos because the church had sponsored us to come. But in my household, my parents, as I said, were very supportive. My father was a feminist in the closet, a closet feminist, and my mother was an outright feminist. So she and my father had always told me as long as I worked really hard, I could achieve what I wanted to achieve. But that there were certain obstacles, and there were times when they wouldn't be able to help me. And that they thought, maybe the teachers or the churches would be spaces where I can build my network and be able to understand the American culture, because at home it wasn't going to be the American culture, it was going to be the Lao culture. They had mentioned it that way because they said that they were intentionally preserving the Lao culture so that I may understand my history. Because as an educator, my father understood that there wasn't going to be any books for me to know about my history. Or my faith, my parents' faith as Buddhists. Now, when I was in school, everyone just said, she's Laotian American and she's this model minority and she's going to do well. Like, even though they were the ones that sponsored us and understood that we came from refugee camps. So I was really confused because I actually didn't know what a model minority was, even though folks were using that terminology with me and there was expectation that I would do well. And so I grew up in a very supportive environment. I felt like at sometimes it was a little bit false when my American friends were rooting me on to do well. It wasn't until in college that I realized how much I had to work more than anyone else, and all the discrimination that I had gone through. And because I was Asian American, I did do well in standardized testing, but that was only because I worked hard and I asked teachers about some of the challenges that I faced in the testing. But from an outside view, people really thought it was because my parents, because they didn't know my parents, that they had paid for standardized testing help and assistance and tutoring. But the fact was that no, my parents had no idea that standardized testing ever existed. It was the fact that the school counselors and the librarians helped me find the books and helped me get free tutor. So it was really confusing. And so when I'm advocating for vulnerable communities and diverse communities, I think back about how it was so confusing for myself and how my parents really lacked understanding, and how, how other perspectives really played a role in the opportunities and lack of opportunities I had. And in my leadership positions now, that type of experience, or those series of experiences that I've had, constantly reshaped about how I approach policy and how I approach community organizing, because I realized that being a refugee Laotian woman, it's more than a dual identity, but a multi-identity, and that us as a community and us as a society are still trying to figure it out together. Discrimination still exists, lack of understanding of gender and sexuality still are prevalent, and at the same time there's a very negative voice currently, a very strong voice that gets on Twitter sometimes that tries to confirm or reshape other people's opinions about certain women and certain ethnic groups and certain immigrants, right? So I use what I have experienced and what I have learned through my leadership and through my collaboration with the community to really go forth with developing something that is better than what is the status quo.
So I think it always seems like there are so many, despite the differences in our stories, I think there are so many common themes that run through our experience and how we are translating that into our roles today as leaders. But for me, I think one thing I didn't mention is that, but you might have been able to guess from my name, is that my family is Muslim, and New Delhi is predominantly Hindu. And so I spent my life very much as Muslims are a minority community in India, and very much so in Delhi. So I was always part of a minority, even when ethnically I was in the same group as everybody growing up. Also, as a child, I went to Catholic school where I was taught by Irish nuns. So talk about being confused. I think you can hopefully forgive me for that. But the interesting thing about having so many different influences is that you can kind of make it what you will. And again, similar to Kristine, I feel like one of the things that my parents certainly gave to me was the confidence to say that I can make of this experience something positive. And one of the things in this world of making sure you succeed is that you couldn't make excuses for failure, which meant that I couldn't get away with saying, I didn't do well in school because my teacher doesn't like me because I'm Muslim, which I could have, which I know people who felt that way. It may have been true. It may actually have even been true for me, but I was always taught that because there's no excuses, you just work harder than everybody else and you make it happen so that there is absolutely no way that people can dismiss you. And kind of bringing that consciousness into my life and how I think about other people now is that it lets you understand how hard it can be when you are in the minority, and how unless you have that support or that push to do well and to not let go, it can be very easy to fall through the cracks. So that, I think, has helped me become more sensitive to the kinds of things that Vatsidi is talking about as well, that in this country, India is actually pretty diverse. May not seem so, but culturally, ethnically as well. But the U.S. is incredibly diverse, and there is stratification that sometimes is very clear, and sometimes really is very hidden and not visible. And to be able, it's kind of important to recognize the things that are not said and not acknowledged, and the implicit biases and implicit distinctions that get made, and to be able to and to make sure that we as leaders are not allowing that to happen, and are trying to make sure that we are creating a world, in whether it's our organization or our society, where we are trying to eliminate those especially those implicit biases, because those are much worse in some ways than the very explicit thing, which can be easily addressed and dealt with.
So, in my education, K through 12, in my history classes, we didn't even, by the time I graduated, really get to internment camps in United States history. So I would say, actually, I had no education in Asian American history whatsoever in my K through 12. So it was more as an adult. And part of the reason I've been drawn to working in public libraries is this idea around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the thing that I love about public libraries the most is that public libraries are supposed to be the place, the safe space for everyone and inviting to everyone. And I know that librarians and library staff members work really hard every day to be a welcoming, safe space for the public that is inclusive, and that is not just by being welcoming, but also hopefully having collections that are reflective and expansive and inclusive, by having content like the content that we're having tonight in terms of programs and discussions, and by supporting intellectual freedom, right? The choices of any member of the community, whether it's a child or an elder, to be able to choose what they want to read and to explore. And I love Kristine's comment that, I think it was Kristine who was talking about authenticity and this notion of that it's okay to be me, and that her parents had fostered that. I think that public libraries also really do that, and that it's okay to be you, whoever you are in the community.
Yeah, briefly. I try to think of the different messages that I've received of what it is supposed to be, as an Asian American woman. And I grew up in predominantly white spaces, and so oftentimes I think the school tried to do like the whole colorblind thing, where if we don't point it out, then everything will be okay. So I kind of drifted, knowing that I was different and did feel tokenized at times, but couldn't pinpoint that at 5 years old. But only now as an adult and someone who works in education and in an Asian American center can I actually talk openly about it. So despite those messages, what I'd rather talk about is the importance of affinity spaces is what really helped me build my counter narrative. So, at school I would learn these messages about me, and similarly, like, we didn't learn about Asian American history, that wasn't really a thing, and that messaging means that we didn't really matter. But outside of school, I was immersed in a really vibrant Filipino and Filipino American community, and so that was like my childhood version of the Asian American Center, I guess, or a version of a Filipino American Student Org. And no wonder why I'm an educator now, because I feel like that kind of pushed me in that direction as a young kid. And I continue to think about, if I didn't have that space, to build the counter narrative, to challenge the messages that I was continuously receiving, whether I understood it or not at the time. I wonder who I would have turned out to be. And granted, I would have always had my parents and family and things like that, but I'm always so grateful that despite the messaging and the microaggressions and the blatant or not so blatant racism, I always had this counter space to exist and to like eat the foods that we eat and dance the dances that we wanted to dance, and hear the languages and speak the languages that felt so normal to us, where we could just exist without all the extra isms that are made to oppress us. I think I owe a lot of my own level of confidence and self-love to that space, and I think that's why I channel so much energy into the work that I do now with students, or whether it's in the classroom, because that affinity space is for our souls in ways that we can't get elsewhere, you know. So even as an adult, do I still get messages of what I'm supposed to be as an Asian American woman? Of course I do, and I'm sure we all do. But how do I find my people in the spaces that will re-energize me, I think is what is most important.
So my question is around mentoring, and so whether it's from mothers, I've heard a lot about mothers so far, whether it's from mothers, family, or other role models in your life, what role has mentoring played in your own development as a leader?
Hopefully not too long. For me, at every single stage of my life, I have had such incredible mentors to whom, who have guided me, who've supported me. Of course, my mother is central to it all, and is one of my greatest inspirations and guides. But you know, one of the very bizarre things, I suppose going with the theme of contradictions, is that all of my other mentors, aside from my mom, have been men. And I hadn't thought about it until just now, as you were asking the question. But I wonder why that is, and there's a part of me, I'm trying to think quickly, is that maybe because as women, we spend so much time doing the thing and kind of sort of paddling upstream to keep up and to be able to do the task that we set for ourselves, that there is less time and energy to support others. I wonder if that has been true of other folks in my life, because I have certainly encountered many incredible women who have been great inspirations, but with whom I've never built that same relationship that I have with teachers and bosses and colleagues who have been men. So I can't say that I have done this yet, but inspired by today, I think I'm going to make sure that I am much more intentional about my relationships with others that I interact with, to make sure that I am taking the time to support them, to support others as well, and not have it be just about getting the job done, which often feels like it's taking up every single minute of your time, but we gotta make the space to support other folks.
So mentors have been a really important part of my experience as well, Iram. I have to say, almost all of them were female. But within the library profession, I think it's a very caring profession, and I think that there's a lot of intentionality around mentoring. I've had both formal mentors through specific programs, such as I'm an ALA Spectrum Scholar, and there is, when I was working in academic libraries, there was a formal college-based and research library-based mentoring program. But some of my best mentors, I think, in terms of continuing that relationship has been through informal mentorships. And that included both women of color as well as Caucasian women. And it's people who have said, you're worth it to take the time to even just converse once in a while about your path in your career, or people that I felt like I could just pick up the phone and call if there was a situation that I was trying to figure out, the best way to move forward. And I would extend that now to a lot of colleagues who are men and women in the field, peers, who are directors, but also I'm learning so much from people at all levels within the library profession. So I think that's also a really important part of in my growth, and learning that it's not just the elders who have something to share and teach me. I think when I was first out of the career, I kind of was like, first into my career, I was starstruck, by some, big name people who had been around for a long time. But as I've developed, I realized that, there are so many people that I'm learning from every day. But some people that I will just call out include Susan Flannery, the former library director here. She was an early mentor of mine and actually encouraged me to pursue my library degree. And there are people like Maureen Sullivan, who is a recent ALA past president, and Patty Wong, who is running the Santa Monica library system, and then Luis Herrera, who recently retired from San Francisco Public Library. A lot of colleagues from American Library Association, as well as the Asian Pacific American Library Association, APALA, including Lesa Paleo-Lozada, Alana Aika-Moore, Sandy Wee, Ray Pun, Eugenia Bay, and Heywan Pak. All of those people have been instrumental in my development and reflection. And like you, Iram, I also think about how I can continue to pass that along too. And I think I do that in some ways, but I think this has been a really affirming night for me to make sure that I'm doing this with intention, and that's something that I hope we can support each other in as being city leaders.
I've had a lot of mentors. Growing up in elementary and high school, I kind of break it up into schools and then distinctive periods of my life. So in elementary school and middle school and high school, the majority of the folks that were my mentors were women, predominantly white women. From my ESL kindergarten teacher, who then later on was the head of the Habitat for Humanity and Rotary Club. She was the one that really encouraged me to apply for scholarships. My godmother, who is German-American, single female, she had a lot of time to really mentor me and take me to jazz festivals and a lot of the community organization meetings in our hometown. But once I got to undergraduate, and in my degree of international relations, it was predominantly white males. And at first, I was really uncomfortable seeking their help because I was raised in, I say I was raised mostly by Laotian American community members and white women. I didn't know how to approach my professors and ask them for help. Luckily, I had to go take a leave just 1 week leave from school for a family emergency, and I was forced to go talk to my professors. And one of my professors really had encouraged me to open up and share my family history with me and my education history with me. And from that conversation, our relationship really bloomed. He encouraged me to be part of the Model United Nations, and then also seek advice from other professors. And that sophomore year in college really helped me, because then I felt okay to be vulnerable to the other professors in the International Relations Department. And I went and talked to the director, who I was extremely scared of, not because he was white male, but because it's just his personality. He was just a very strong, very vocal, opinionated person, and the director of the department. But I just went to him and I said, look, the reason why I'm really interested in international relations is because of my family's history, and I really would like to better understand how treaties are passed in our government, the halls in our government buildings, and I just don't know where those opportunities are. And he's like, oh, I got you. I'm like, oh, really? That was quick. Like, that was really easy. It's like, do I have to give you a resume? He's like, well, work on your resume, but I will call Senator Ben Nelson. And I was like, Senator Ben Nelson, like the guy that goes to Congress? He goes, yep. It's like, I promise you we'll get you an internship. So I worked really hard with him on the resume, my first resume ever, and submitted for my my second-ish internship, because it was my sophomore year in college, and I got the job. But it really took the effort of a white male professor to get me at a comfort level to be able to share a lot of my family history, because in college I just felt my colleagues and peers, although we enjoyed hanging out together, they were kind of ahead of me. I knew that they had privilege over me, and I just always felt that they would do better than me. So the internships that they were applying for didn't seem so close of a reach, and that really helped. And that really helped me in law school as well, because then I was like, you know what, I've been through this before, and most of the professors are white males, but they have helped me in the past. And throughout law school and opening up my law firm, it was all white male professors, whether they're Jewish or whether they were third generation American or international scholars. They were all very helpful, and I think that that's why I was able to really succeed in providing services to immigrants and small businesses, and have my own law firm for a few years. Having that type of experience and seeing where mentorship can come from and the support can come from really gave me the comfort level to embrace so much more and to approach folks that I might think that their perspective may not be as positive. And so I really, I have a long list of folks to thank, but I am so very thankful and grateful for those opportunities that they have provided me and helped me get.
So mentorship is really everything to me. And I can think of all the people who have helped me along my journey. My definition of mentorship has evolved over time to where I believe it's a mutual process, because I really believe in our collective power to support each other. And I say that because I think mentorship to me at least, transcends power and transcends age in a lot of ways, or other identities, because I very much draw lessons from a lot of the people that I get to interact with, and that includes not only people who say have more power hierarchically, but also students that I get to work with, because anyone that I can present myself fully to and talk honestly with, I am also able to hear their narratives in a lot of ways, supports me in my growth and like the building of my philosophy of who I am as an educator and an Asian American woman. Because I think traditionally, I've always perceived mentoring to be like, I'm the mentee and I'm a mentor, or students will see me as a mentor and themselves as the mentee, but I'm more kind of like in this space where if a student comes to me and they're like, I need help, / I need to be mentored, I'm more like, well, we're going to figure this out collectively, because I think that they too have the answers, they too have what they need. It's just a matter of like drawing that out, So I perceive that with students I work with, but also with like either friends or other colleagues, because I think it's a mutual process, the same way that I view justice and the same way I view equity and inclusion. And I don't know what it is. I think as Asian American women, while I can't speak for all of us, I think to be visible and to have a voice, I've tried to like nurture that with the people I'm with, to really like believe in that collective power, because I also believe in the whole like it takes a village to get places, because I know I wouldn't be here without the village. And so I think it's so important to not only find people that I aspire to be, but then also to find people who will also be honest with me and critical of me and be truthful with me. And that might not necessarily be like a person in the position that I'm like striving to be in. You know what I mean? So, and that's why I say like I think it's a collective thing and a mutual process, because in the traditional sense, it's like, oh, who is like higher than me to learn lessons from. But I know for me, some of the most powerful lessons I've ever learned have been from students. And they might not know it, but I think a lot about what they have taught me. And I say that because, again, I think leadership transcends different things like age and identity and power and hierarchy. So
I think it's a little unfair because Kristine and I work together, but I think a lot about, when I think about mentoring, I think about community and like when people are brought up by community. And I think as for myself, like as an Asian American woman, there's so many times when I'm the only, whether it's woman in a room or Asian American in a room or Asian American woman, or all these different things that relate to my own identity. But I also think about the level of caring, and I think for that caring piece, not just about professional growth or prestige or power, but to find people that care about you like as an entire person, I think is really important. And I think for me, some of the people that I would say are my strongest, or my most important mentors are the people whose first real question is, how are you? And they're not just like checking in, but they want to know, how are you, before we have a conversation, about, education or about my goals or about my family or how I'm navigating this, but really, coming from a place of care, for me as a human, with all of the things that I'm managing, I think is really, really important. And, I think hearing, from all of your different experiences and ways that, the community and people and teachers and mentors have given to your lives, I think, I'm hearing like the caring piece, as being, one of the foundational parts about mentoring.